Devon, 1945. The farm gate swung open onto a stone cottage surrounded by fields that rolled toward distant hills, the air thick with the smell of animals and earth and growing things. Through the truck's canvas opening, German women stared at the family waiting by the farmhouse door, faces showing the exhaustion of people who had stopped expecting anything good. They had been told what to expect from British farm families: hatred from civilians whose cities had been bombed, whose sons had died fighting Germans, whose lives had been shattered by 6 years of war. Violence disguised as work assignments, cruelty wrapped in rural isolation where no witnesses would intervene, revenge served cold through deliberate neglect. What they saw instead made them freeze mid-step. A British farm wife waving in greeting, children peeking from behind her skirts with curiosity rather than fear, an elderly farmer approaching the truck with weathered face showing something that looked almost like welcome. For a moment, the only sound was wind through apple trees just beginning to bloom. Everything they had been taught about British civilian hatred, about rage that would surely manifest away from camp supervision, about revenge that rural isolation would enable, was about to collide with something impossible. A farm family treating enemy prisoners like workers who deserved basic human kindness. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive. So do me one favor. Tap like so this story isn't buried, show support by subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter. And share this video so more people discover the truth history tried to hide. The journey to this bewildering moment had begun 9 weeks earlier on a cold March morning outside Hamburg. Liesel Weber stood among 175 women in a commandeered school building, her Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform showing communications insignia she'd worn while operating radar equipment for 3 years. She was 25, a teacher's daughter from Stuttgart, who had believed every word about serving the Reich until British bombs had made belief feel like luxury she couldn't afford. Around her, nurses from field hospitals, factory supervisors who'd managed munitions production, telephone operators from military installations, even a veterinarian from Dresden who'd cared for army horses, all captured as British forces swept through northern Germany. They had expected immediate execution, or perhaps something worse. The propaganda had been explicit and specific. British civilians, especially rural families who'd lost sons to German guns and daughters to German bombs, would take out 6 years of rage on German women given into their power. Farm work assignments were code for isolated abuse, for revenge that camp's Geneva Convention observers would never witness. Instead, they received medical examinations that checked for tuberculosis and pregnancy, basic hygiene facilities that suggested someone cared about health, and transport to Britain under conditions that were uncomfortable but not deliberately cruel. The Channel crossing was miserable in ways that transcended nationality. Seasickness that turned the world inside out. Cold that worked through wool uniforms with patient malice. Darkness broken only by guards with torches checking that no one had died overnight. Women huddled together for warmth, some praying in whispers, others silent with the resignation of those who'd already surrendered hope of seeing home again. Liesel kept a small pencil stub and folded paper hidden in her undergarments, writing when possible. March 15th, 1945. We sail to England. To farms, they say. To work for British families. Propaganda promised these families would kill us, slowly and creatively, taking revenge for all they lost. I am more frightened now than I was when the bombs fell. At least bombs were impersonal. Hatred is not. The English countryside struck differently than German landscape when they disembarked at Plymouth. Softer somehow, more green even in early spring, with hedgerows that divided fields into manageable parcels and stone walls that suggested generations of patient maintenance. Villages they passed looked intact, functional, continuing life, as if war happened somewhere else entirely. No rubble-strewn streets, no bombed-out buildings, no visible scars of total war that had consumed Germany. The disconnect was immediate and disconcerting. British soldiers processed them with bureaucratic efficiency that felt neither hostile nor friendly, just professional. They were sorted by physical capability, language skills, and farm experience. Liesel, who'd grown up helping her grandmother's garden and spoke adequate English, was assigned to Group C, women going to working farms needing help with planting, livestock care, and household assistance. 20 women per group. Each group divided among 4 or 5 farms in same region. The trucks drove west through Devon countryside showing early spring promise. Trees budding, fields being prepared for planting, livestock grazing on hills that seemed impossibly green compared to war-exhausted German farmland. Everything suggested a nation that, while clearly rationing and managing resources carefully, was nowhere near the collapse promised by propaganda. "Why does it look so normal?" whispered Anna Becker in German. She was 23, a nurse from Berlin who'd believed completely in propaganda about Britain's imminent collapse through starvation and bombing. They said British were starving, said farms were failing, said everything was destroyed. But look, it's all still here. An older woman, Margaret Klein, a 38-year-old factory supervisor from Munich who'd seen too much to believe anything anymore, replied quietly, "Either propaganda lied, or everything we're seeing is elaborate deception meant to confuse us before the real horror begins. Given our recent track record with truth, I'm suspecting the former." Camp 83 emerged from Yorkshire moorland like a temporary city that had achieved permanence through necessity. Rows of wooden huts arranged with military precision, administrative buildings showing signs of long-term occupation, and everywhere this British pragmatism that felt different from German military culture. Not harsh discipline, but simple expectation that adults would do what needed doing, because that's what adults did. The camp commandant was a British lieutenant colonel named Patricia Thornhill, one of few women holding such rank, 47 years old with a bearing that suggested she'd earned respect through competence rather than connections. She stood at the administration building entrance as trucks delivered prisoners, her uniform showing medal ribbons from military nursing service in the First War. "You will be treated according to Geneva Convention requirements," she said, through a translator, a German Jewish woman who'd fled to Britain in 1936. Her voice was firm, but not harsh. "Most of you will work on local farms. British agriculture is struggling with labour shortages because young men are at war. Farm families need help. You will provide that help. In exchange, you will be housed, fed, treated fairly, and paid small wages for your labour." The German women stood in formation, March wind cutting through thin coats, trying to process these words that sounded too reasonable to be true. Paid wages and treated fairly, and farm families suggested normality that couldn't possibly apply to enemy prisoners working for civilians whose relatives had died fighting Germans. Colonel Thornhill continued, "You will be supervised by guards during transport and while working. But understand this, British farm families volunteered to host you. They were not forced. They asked for help because they need it. They understand you are prisoners, but have agreed to treat you as workers. What happens next depends on both sides maintaining professional relationships based on mutual respect and honest labour." That night, in barracks that were basic but weathertight, women talked in nervous clusters about what farm families volunteered could possibly mean. Why would British civilians volunteer to host German prisoners? What kind of revenge was disguised as voluntary hosting? What would happen when guards weren't watching, when isolation and rural privacy enabled whatever cruelty these families had planned? Morning came early. 5:30 roll call, then breakfast that was adequate if not abundant. Porridge, bread, tea, followed by loading into trucks for transport to assigned farms. Liesel's group of 5 women was headed to a farm called Meadowbrook, managed by the Hartley family, Thomas and Mary Hartley, ages 52 and 48, their daughter Sarah, aged 20, and Mary's father Albert, aged 74. The family had lost one son at Normandy, another was fighting in Germany now, and they were managing 180 acres with inadequate labour. The truck wound through Devon lanes too narrow for military vehicles, hedgerows brushing both sides, emerging finally at a stone farmhouse that looked like it had stood for centuries. The family waited by the door, exactly as described in Liesel's opening moment. Mary Hartley waving, two younger children peeking out, grandchildren, Liesel would learn later. Thomas Hartley approaching the truck with face that showed decades of outdoor work but no obvious hostility. A British corporal named James Mitchell, 35 years old, would supervise the work party. He was a farmer's son himself, understanding agricultural work, speaking adequate German from pre-war university studies. He helped each woman down from the truck with professional courtesy that felt surreal. Enemy soldiers being assisted by guards as if they were ladies at a social function rather than prisoners assigned to labour. Mary Hartley approached, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron, her face showing lines of grief and work and something else Liesel couldn't identify. Not hatred, not contempt, something softer, more complex. "Welcome to Meadowbrook," she said in English, then repeated through Corporal Mitchell's translation. "I know this is strange for everyone. You're far from home, probably frightened, certainly uncertain about what to expect from us. I want to be clear. You're here to work, yes, but you're also human beings far from home during terrible times. We'll treat you as we'd want our sons treated if they're prisoners somewhere." Her voice wavered slightly. "We lost Edward at Normandy. Michael is somewhere in Germany now. We could hate all Germans for that. Would be our right. But hate won't bring Edward back. Won't protect Michael. Won't get the spring planting done, so we choose different. We choose to see you as women caught in circumstances none of us wanted, doing work that needs doing." Liesel stood frozen, trying to process words that contradicted everything she'd been prepared for. This woman had lost a son to German fire, had another son fighting Germans currently. And her response was to talk about choosing not to hate, about treating enemies as humans. It made no sense according to propaganda logic that insisted British civilians would take revenge when given opportunity. Thomas Hartley stepped forward, his weathered face showing exhaustion that transcended physical tiredness. "Work starts at 7, he said simply. "Livestock need feeding, eggs need collecting, fields need preparing for planting. You'll work same hours we work, eat same food we eat, rest when we rest. Anyone works honestly gets treated fairly. That's the arrangement." The first day was genuine farm labour. Feeding chickens, collecting eggs, mucking out stables, helping prepare seedbeds for spring vegetables. The work was physically demanding, but not cruelly so, and Thomas Hartley worked alongside them, showing proper technique, correcting mistakes with patience rather than anger. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done these tasks for decades, and he expected competence but seemed to understand they were learning. At midday, something happened that crystallized the disconnect between expectation and reality. Mary Hartley called everyone to the farmhouse for lunch. Liesel and the other German women approached warily, expecting to eat separately, probably outside, certainly not in the family's home. Instead, Mary directed them to a long wooden table in the kitchen where places had been set for everyone, family and prisoners together. The food was simple but genuine. Soup made from vegetables and some kind of meat, bread that was coarse but real, cheese, tea. Mary served everyone with the same portions, the same attention, sitting down herself to eat the same food. The Hartley children stared openly at the German women with curiosity rather than fear. Albert, the elderly grandfather, said grace in English that Liesel understood included thanks for workers who helped the farm and a prayer for all soldiers everywhere, including Michael fighting in Germany. They ate in uncomfortable silence initially, the surreal situation overwhelming normal social interaction. Then, Sarah Hartley, the 20-year-old daughter, spoke directly to Liesel, who'd been identified as the one with best English. "What part of Germany are you from?" Liesel hesitated, uncertain if answering was allowed or advisable. Corporal Mitchell nodded slightly, indicating it was acceptable to respond. "Stuttgart, in the south." Is Stuttgart destroyed? We heard the bombing was terrible. Yes. Much destroyed. My family's home was in the old quarter. Now is rubble. Sarah's face showed genuine sympathy. I'm sorry. That must be awful, not knowing if your family is safe. This simple expression of sympathy for German suffering from a British woman whose brother had died fighting Germans was so unexpected that Liesel felt tears starting. She blinked them away, confused by kindness when she'd prepared for hatred. Mary noticed. You must be terrified about your family, she said gently. We know that feeling. Every day we don't hear from Michael, we imagine the worst. War is horror for everyone involved, isn't it? Destroys families on all sides. That afternoon, working in the vegetable garden preparing beds for peas and beans, Liesel found herself beside Mary, both women on their knees in dirt, hands working with the rhythm of people who understand growing things. Mary talked while working, not interrogating, but simply sharing, about the farm, about how hard it had been since Edward died and Michael left, about how her father Albert tried to help but was too old for heavy work, about how Sarah did her best but couldn't manage everything alone. We didn't want to take prisoners, Mary said at one point. Felt strange asking for German workers when Germans killed our son, but the alternative was letting the farm fail. Letting crops not get planted, letting animals go untended, and that felt like letting Edward's death mean nothing, like giving up on the farm he loved, so we asked for help. And now you're here. And it's strange and uncomfortable, but it's also just people working together because work needs doing. Why are you being kind? Liesel asked, the question that had been building since arrival. You could hate us, could treat us terribly, and no one would stop you. We are prisoners. We are enemy. Your son died because of Germans. Why kindness? Mary was quiet for a long moment, her hands continuing to prepare soil with practiced motions. Finally, because Edward wouldn't want us to become cruel. Because Michael would be ashamed if we used other people's tragedy for revenge. Because we were raised to believe that how you treat people matters. Especially how you treat people you have power over. Because kindness costs nothing and might make terrible situation slightly less terrible. She paused. And because I keep thinking, if Michael is prisoner somewhere, I hope someone is being kind to him. Maybe if we're kind to you, karma or God, or simple human decency means someone will be kind to him. Maybe that's magical thinking, but it's what I choose to believe. That evening, riding back to camp in the truck as sun set over Devon Hills, the 5 women who'd worked at Meadowbrook Farm sat in stunned silence, processing a day that had contradicted every expectation. No cruelty, no revenge, no hatred acted upon. Just a grieving family that had chosen to maintain their principles even when abandoning those principles would have been completely understandable. They fed us at their table, whispered Anna, still disbelieving. Same food they ate, same table, like we were workers rather than enemies. She asked about my family, Liesel said. Asked with genuine concern. Her son died fighting Germans, and she felt sympathy for German families suffering. How is that possible? Margaret, the older factory supervisor, spoke with the weariness of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions. Maybe we were lied to about British people, the same way we were lied to about everything else. Maybe they're not monsters seeking revenge. Maybe they're just people trying to survive war while maintaining some shred of humanity. Maybe that's what civilians in civilized nations do. The pattern continued through April and into May. 3 days per week at Meadowbrook Farm, working alongside the Hartley family, eating meals together, gradually breaking down the barrier between enemy and human. The work was genuine agricultural labour, planting, weeding, livestock care, equipment repair. And the Hartleys worked as hard as the prisoners, demonstrating that this wasn't exploitation, but shared necessity. Slowly, relationships formed. Sarah Hartley taught Liesel and Anna English idioms while they worked, laughing at mistakes, patient with pronunciation, sharing stories about life before war. Albert told stories about farming in the old days, about changes he'd seen over 74 years, about believing that people were fundamentally similar, regardless of nationality. Thomas showed them efficient techniques for various farm tasks, taking satisfaction when they learned quickly, never expressing frustration when they didn't. And Mary became something like a maternal figure, not replacing mothers, but providing steadiness that women far from home desperately needed. She noticed when someone was struggling emotionally, offered tea and quiet conversation, never pried, but always listened if someone wanted to talk. She shared photographs of Edward and Michael, spoke about them with love and grief intertwined, allowed German women to see British soldiers as sons and brothers rather than faceless enemies. One afternoon in late April, while helping Mary preserve early vegetables from the greenhouse, Liesl asked the question that had been growing in her mind for weeks. "How do you do it? How do you show kindness to Germans when Germans took your son?" Mary's hands continued working, cutting vegetables with practiced efficiency, but her voice showed strain. "I don't know if I'm doing it right. Some days I look at you lot and think about Edward and I want to scream. Want to blame you even though I know you didn't personally kill him. Want to take out all this grief and rage on someone and you're here and you're German and it would be so easy." She paused, blinking back tears. "But then I think, you didn't choose this war. You didn't decide to invade countries or bomb cities. You got caught up in something bigger than yourselves, same as Edward did, same as Michael is. Your mothers and daughters and sisters, same as we are. And I think about what Edward would want. He wasn't a person who hated. He was kind, thoughtful, gentle despite being soldier. He'd be ashamed if I used his death as excuse to become cruel. So you're kind because of who he was. I'm kind because of who I want to be. Because I believe how you treat people in worst circumstances shows what you really are. Because being kind to you lot doesn't dishonor Edward. It honors him by proving his death didn't turn me into something he wouldn't recognize." She looked directly at Liesl. "Does it make sense? I'm not even sure it does to me some days." "It makes sense," Liesl said quietly. "It makes more sense than anything propaganda told us about British people. We were taught you were weak, cruel, without principles. But you're none of those things. You're strong enough to choose kindness when cruelty would be easier. That's strength propaganda never explained." In May, something happened that tested and then deepened the relationship between prisoners and the Hartley family. News arrived that Michael had been wounded in Germany, was in American field hospital, would survive, but was coming home. The relief and joy in the Hartley household was palpable, but it was accompanied by awkwardness. Celebrating the survival of a soldier who'd been fighting against Germany while German prisoners worked the farm felt complicated. Mary approached the prisoners directly. "Michael is coming home. He was wounded, but he'll recover. I wanted you to know because, well, because you're part of our lives now, strange as that sounds, and because his coming home might make things awkward. He fought in Germany. He killed German soldiers. That's the reality we all have to live with." The prisoners stood silent, unsure how to respond. Finally, Liesl spoke. "We are glad he lives. We are glad you will have your son back. War makes enemies of people who would never otherwise harm each other. Michael did what soldiers do. Our brothers did what soldiers did. We can be glad when anyone survives this terrible thing, even when they fought on different sides." Mary's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and squeezed Liesl's hand briefly, the first deliberate physical contact beyond work necessities. "Thank you. That means more than you know." When Michael returned in mid-May, thin and scarred but alive, the farm work continued with new awkwardness. Michael was polite but distant, struggling with seeing German women working land. His brother had died defending. He avoided the prisoners initially, ate separately, maintained rigid boundaries. But after several days, something shifted. Michael was working on repairing a fence section when Liesl and Anna were nearby weeding a vegetable bed. He watched them work with growing recognition. "You actually know what you're doing," he said abruptly. Liesel looked up, startled. "Sir?" "The weeding. You're doing it correctly, not just pulling anything green. Removing actual weeds while protecting the vegetables. Someone taught you proper technique." "Your father taught us, and I helped my grandmother's garden as child." Michael nodded slowly. "You speak good English." "I was teacher before war, taught English to German students." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I fought near Stuttgart, your city. I'm sorry for what we did there. Orders were orders, but I'm still sorry." The apology from British soldier to German civilian for military action was so unexpected that Liesel couldn't immediately respond. Finally, "I am sorry for what my country did to yours, for your brother, for this war. For everything." "We're all sorry," Michael said quietly. "Everyone's sorry and everyone's dead or broken, and I don't know what any of it was for." He paused. "My mother says you've been good workers, that you've helped keep the farm running. I want you to know I appreciate that, even if it's strange saying it." From that difficult beginning, Michael gradually integrated into the work routine that included German prisoners. He remained reserved but fair, occasionally shared stories about his service when asked, listened when prisoners talked about their experiences. The war had broken something in him that might never fully heal, but he was trying to maintain his mother's philosophy about treating people decently even when circumstances were complicated. June brought victory in Europe and questions about what would happen to prisoners. At Meadowbrook Farm, the uncertainty was palpable. The Hartleys had come to depend on the German workers. The prisoners had found something like stability in the routine. Everyone understood this arrangement was temporary, but no one wanted to discuss how temporary. One evening, after a long day of hay cutting, Mary invited the prisoners to join the family for supper, not the working lunch but the family evening meal. This was unprecedented, a crossing of final boundaries that had remained even as other barriers dissolved. The meal was simple: potatoes, vegetables from their own garden, a small piece of precious meat, bread. They sat around the table that had become familiar, the awkwardness less pronounced than months earlier, something like comfort settling over the group. Thomas raised his glass of cider. "I want to say something. You lot came here as prisoners, as enemies, as people we had every reason to resent. You're leaving, eventually, as people we've come to respect. You've worked honestly, helped save our farm, been part of keeping this family going through terrible time. Whatever happens next, wherever you end up, you should know you made difference here. This farm survives partially because of your labour. That matters." Mary added, "You should also know that you changed how we think about Germans, about enemies, about war itself. We started this thinking German prisoners were faceless enemies. We end it knowing that you're women with families and homes and lives that were interrupted by circumstances beyond your control. That's a valuable lesson. That's what Edward would have wanted us to learn." Liesel responded for the group. Her English much improved through months of daily use. "We came here expecting hatred, expecting punishment disguised as work. We found instead family that showed us kindness when cruelty would have been justified. You taught us that British people are not what propaganda claimed. You taught us that civilization means maintaining principles even when those principles are difficult. You taught us that enemies can become, if not friends, then people who respect each other. We will carry those lessons home. We'll teach others. We'll tell people that British farm family who lost son to Germans still chose kindness over revenge. That is strength propaganda never explained." Repatriation began in July. Groups processed, documented, given travel papers, sent home to Germany that no longer resembled the nation they'd left. Liesel's group was scheduled for August, 5 months after arriving in Britain. One lifetime education received. The final day at Meadowbrook Farm felt like morning. The prisoners had been part of daily rhythm, part of farm operations, part of family life in ways that transcended official prisoner-civilian boundaries. Mary packed food for their journey, including precious items from her own rations. Sarah gave each woman a letter of reference for future employment, documenting their agricultural skills and character. Albert pressed small packets of seeds into their hands, vegetables that would grow well in Germany, a gesture toward future rather than past. Thomas gathered everyone one last time by the barn. I want you to understand what you've been part of. This farm has been in my family for 3 generations. It would have failed this year without your help. We couldn't have gotten crops planted, couldn't have maintained livestock, couldn't have survived Edward's death and Michael's absence. You saved this farm. You saved this family's legacy. I don't care what propaganda says about enemies and nationality. I know what I've seen. You're good people who did honest work in terrible circumstances. That's what I'll remember. Michael, still struggling with his own demons, spoke briefly. I killed Germans in Germany. That's fact I live with. But I'm glad I didn't kill you lot. Glad you survived to help my family. Glad something good came from this horror. I hope you find your families alive. I hope Germany rebuilds. I hope we never do this again. Mary embraced each prisoner. A violation of regulations. A crossing of boundaries that no longer seemed to matter. You're always welcome here, she said through tears. If you ever come back to England, if you ever need anything, Meadowbrook Farm will remember you. You're part of our story now, part of our family's history. We'll tell our grandchildren about the German women who helped save the farm during the war. We'll tell them about choosing kindness over revenge. We'll tell them that war makes enemies, but humanity can still survive if people choose it. The drive back to camp felt like severing limbs. 5 women who'd expected cruelty had found kindness, who'd expected hatred had found acceptance, who'd expected isolation had found something like belonging. The Britain they'd been taught to fear had proven gentler than the Germany they'd been taught to serve. That evening, writing in the diary she'd maintained throughout, Liesl recorded, "Today, we said goodbye to Meadowbrook Farm. To the Hartley family who lost son to Germans but chose to treat German prisoners with dignity and kindness. They taught us that strength means maintaining principles, even when abandoning them would be justified. That civilization means choosing humanity over revenge, that people can transcend national hatred if they simply decide to see each other as human beings. I am returning to destroyed Germany, carrying knowledge that British civilians proved better than propaganda claimed, and German ideology proved worse than propaganda admitted. This knowledge will shape how I live whatever life comes next." The journey back was long. Trains, ships, transit camps, arriving finally in Germany that resembled photographs of apocalypse. Liesl returned to Stuttgart, to Rubble where her family home had been, finding her mother and sister living in a basement, her father dead from malnutrition in April. That first night, reunited with family she'd thought she might never see again, Liesl shared food the Hartleys had packed: bread, preserved vegetables, precious items that were feast by German standards of August 1945. Her mother ate reverently, asking where such food came from. "From British farm family I worked for as prisoner. They gave it for our journey. They gave us seeds for planting. They gave us letters of reference. They gave us proof that not everyone in this war became monster." In months and years that followed, Liesl rebuilt her life using principles learned at Meadowbrook Farm. She became a teacher again, teaching English, but also teaching about choosing humanity over hatred, about civilians who maintained principles even under horror, about farm family that showed enemies kindness. She planted the seeds Mary had given her, cultivated vegetables that fed her family and neighbours, told everyone they came from British women who'd lost son to Germans, but chose to help rather than hate. Anna returned to Berlin, found work with British occupation authorities, brought to it the understanding that former enemies could become partners if treated with dignity. She advocated for fair treatment of German civilians by occupation forces, often citing the Hartley family as example of how to maintain civilization even toward those who'd been enemies. Margaret returned to Munich, reopened her factory with focus on civilian goods rather than military equipment, managed it with principles learned from watching Mary Hartley maintain farm through crisis. Treat people fairly, work honestly, maintain standards even when standards are difficult, choose long-term stability over short-term exploitation. Mary Hartley continued farming Meadowbrook with Thomas and Michael through the post-war years, building the operation back to prosperity. She never spoke publicly about German prisoners who'd worked the farm, considering it simply what decent people did during difficult times. But she kept letters from Liesel and others, letters describing their lives in rebuilt Germany, letters proving that kindness during war could plant seeds that grew across decades. Thomas retired in 1960, proud that Meadowbrook had survived war and post-war challenges, proud that his family had maintained principles even when tested by grief and anger. When asked about German prisoners, he said simply, "They were good workers who helped when we needed it. That's all that matters." Michael struggled with post-war trauma for years, but eventually found peace through farming and family. His children grew up hearing stories about German women who'd worked Meadowbrook during the war, learning that enemies were humans, that hatred was choice rather than requirement, that their grandmother's kindness had been strength rather than weakness. What happened at Meadowbrook Farm and thousands of similar farms across Britain was not widely documented. It didn't fit comfortable narratives about wartime hatred and post-war reconciliation. But it was real. German prisoners worked British farms alongside British families who had every reason for revenge but chose kindness. Those encounters transformed understanding more effectively than any official program, proved that civilian contact could build bridges faster than government policy. Historians later noted that German POWs who worked British farms returned home with transformed perspectives about British people, about civilian prisoner relationships, about choosing humanity over hatred. They had lived experience of families who maintained principles under grief, who treated enemies with basic dignity, who demonstrated that civilization could survive war if people simply decided to remain civilized. The farm where Liesel Weber discovered that kindness was stronger than hatred still operates today, run by Hartley descendants who know stories about German prisoners who helped save the family legacy during war. The land remembers, in the way land does, being tended by hands from two nations working together because decent people decided that work and humanity mattered more than nationality and revenge. The German women who expected British civilian hatred found instead British farm families who chose principles over payback. Found people whose grief was real, but whose humanity was stronger. Found living proof that propaganda lied about what mattered most, that ordinary people in terrible circumstances can still choose to be kind. And in that choice, in that daily decision to treat enemies as humans deserving of dignity, something more powerful than any military victory was achieved. Not reconciliation, which would come later, but recognition. Recognition that the distance between enemy and human was shorter than propaganda claimed, that crossing that distance required only choosing to see clearly rather than through hate's distortion. That is the quiet victory that changes futures. That is the transformation that happens one act of kindness at a time, one meal shared at a family table, one moment of choosing humanity when revenge would be easier. In the end, it wasn't British policy or official programs that convinced German prisoners that civilization could survive war. It was British farm families who lived their principles daily, who maintained their humanity when testing it was hardest, who proved that strength meant choosing kindness even when loss justified cruelty. That is the lesson echoing across 8 decades. That is the truth surviving when propaganda is forgotten. That is the hope remaining when everything else is destroyed. Kindness is not weakness. Humanity is not surrender. Treating enemies with dignity is not betrayal of those lost to war. It is honoring them by refusing to let war destroy what makes us human. And sometimes, that lesson arrives at a farm gate in Devon, where a grieving mother chooses to welcome rather than wound, to teach rather than torment, to show that the truest victory is remaining civilized when no one would judge you for becoming cruel.